and I won't elaborate on that, but I've been in the interface space, although most of the work I've done in the interface space has been around finding the connections between different spiritual and religious traditions that focus on learning about nature, both learning and nature. I mean, one of the things I love about the Jewish faith is this deep passion for learning. Anyway, so it's that, and it's in fact a book that Reb Zalman participated in called The Heart of Learning. The Heart of Learning, all about spirituality and education, that came out of Naropa University's programs there. So what I'm going to do for the rest of my 10 plus a few minutes is describe a few activities that relate to interconnectedness, or the inter of connectedness, or trans-connectedness. All these, what's going on in the world. And what I loved about Social Vision and Phil's work is I'm fully embraced from different perspectives this whole notion that we're transforming civilization and re-enchanting it as we, and that's so essential. So the first thing I'll say is I look for points of leverage in society where you can hold a conversation that might transform larger parts of society. So I wrote a book called The Myth of Alzheimer's Disease, and the latest one that's coming out from Hopkins is American Dementia, Brain Health in an Unhealthy Society. So I think all of the things we've talked about so far in this conference and in the books about materialism, and if we just spend enough money, we'll cure Alzheimer's disease. And it's care today and cure tomorrow, which is the motto, which is a little silly to think we could somehow cure things and not have to care in the future. So that's one of the lever points in which I'm trying to, in fact, we're just launching today, or reimagining dementia with a variety of perspectives offered there. So we're connecting different counter-current movements to the dominant pharmaceutical company. Just give us enough tax break and give somebody a Nobel Prize and we'll fix this for people. If I'm making it sound bordering on the psychotic, I actually think it is. The other lens that I think is an important one is the lens of bioethics, specifically within the framework of medicine. That has become, in my view, rather narrow in its scope on the consequences of medical technologies. So the man who invented the word bioethics, some bioethicists don't know this, was Van Rensselaer Potter, who was inspired by Aldo Leopold, who was a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin. And so this notion that our focus on values in medicine needs to be connected to the values in public health ethics and to the values of environmental ethics is another example of interconnectedness. Because values, like mysticism itself, are so deep and at the core, you can bring things together down there and then hope as we bring them out back into the real world, the connections will be more profound. I've never kind of put it that way before, but the deep ecology movement tried to put the spirit back into ecology, and that's what we're trying to do in bioethics. As Eli kindly mentioned, my wife and I started 3 public intergenerational schools in Cleveland with youngsters who largely, when we started, came from rather disadvantaged neighborhoods. In that space, people with older people and younger people have deep relationship-based conversations about the future, their own futures, and the future of the planet. One of my courses that I offered at a long-term care facility here was called Wising Up, Designing a Course for the Future, and we focused on intergenerational activism and spirited citizenship. So I think the intergenerational lens, which is evident everywhere, but not manifest everywhere, or maybe it's latent but not manifest in some sense. So bringing into the space conversations about the future that involve youngsters and older folks, and I love spiritual traditions, religious traditions in which that occurs, but to think about their responsibilities for a common future. I've got 3 more, and then I'll wrap up. there's another force in the world that I think is very interesting, particularly for academics concerned about the future of universities and their relationships to the larger community. That's transdisciplinarity. Many people will use the word inter, and I mentioned I would go from inter, which is kind of between, to trans, which is beyond. Transdisciplinarians, based out of Paris, there's a big international center there, led by, or until recently, led by a theoretical physicist, talk about the importance of complexity, the importance of levels of reality, the importance of hidden things that aren't accounted for in the mainstream ways of thinking about disciplines. Kind of like quantum physics is telling us there are lots of hidden things that we don't understand. Transdisciplinary embraces that mystery that ought to be at the core of science, which is often missing. And it's not just science, it's other transdisciplinary approaches as well. But the thing that I like about them morally is they have a moral code. They think universities are not well organized to address wicked, let's use that expression, complex problems in the world. So they are primarily motivated to say to universities, hey, you're medieval, in a kind of pejorative sense of, how are we going to structure knowledge in service of our species' survival? And I guess I mean that both physically and spiritually in these complex times. Two more quickly. The International Big History Association, the Deep Time Network. There are a bunch of historians who are now saying, listen, we need to start with the history, the Big Bang. Let's put it at that point. We've got to think of ourselves as a species that exists in a history that goes back, according to that view, almost 14 billion years. And I could elaborate on that, but this notion that cosmological perspective, which I will actually end with, is really essential to helping us feel as individual human beings and as groups in this post-secular world, feeling there's a convergence around that cosmological. Finally, I'm part of a group of echozoans. So Thomas Berry and Thierry de Chardin, I think David mentioned that this morning, the idea that there's a new story to be told. And it is a story of connection. And it is a story of relationships to nature and to each other. And it is a story that is post-secular, that has a dimensionality to it, which, the Roman Catholic priest Thierry de Chardin tried to balance his science and his views of the noosphere, a word that he and others coined to characterize this notion we're moving to some kind of new level of consciousness. So those are some examples of interconnections. How do you connect the connections? So I created and this is where I'm going to end, on the Presencing Institute, which is based out of the MIT Center for Organizational Learning, under the umbrella of a project called Gaia, Global Activation of Intention and Activation. So you just Google Presencing Institute, look for the Interhub. So that's what we call it. So all those groups that I just mentioned, we're bringing into some kind of conversation space to try to figure out what is it that emerges when people who come from very different perspectives learn to come and co-create cosmodernity. So that's the word I'm using. I used to say I was an asymptotic postmodernist. I didn't quite understand enough to label myself, and I say, what's after? Well, now I'm using cosmodernity. I think we have to re-enchant, we have to bring the cosmic back in so many different ways. Yes, cosmology in the sense of physics and science, but yes, cosmologies in the sense of indigenous peoples and modern religions that are struggling with this notion of how do human beings fit in the cosmos. So I am, as I started off saying, delighted to be amongst people, that I'm meeting for the first time in many cases, who share this deep passion for that the Rebbe shared. And by the way, I would say after the first conference, I attended a few Shabbat experiences, and it's just wonderful. I love the idea and the values behind this process. So thank you very much for including me, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Peter. That was a wonderful talk, and it's wonderful to hear about all the different dimensions of the interconnectedness at which you sit at the center. And over to you, Don Seeman.
Thank you, Peter. That's a hard act to follow. I want to thank Philip and Eli Rubin for the opportunity to be here. I've been following your individual and joint projects for a long time, and they're all intriguing, every one of them. If Peter Whitehouse is sort of starting from the position of re-enchanting the universe, and what some of these ideas that, for instance, Philip talks about in his book, how they can be applied more broadly on a civilizational spectrum. My work as an anthropologist and a student of religion really starts from the opposite direction. I'm interested in how these metaphysics or concepts of mystical experience are grounded in different forms of everyday life. And by trying to trace those connections, maybe say something more about what they are, what they entail. Okay, I'll just give you one example. One of the great scholars of Chabad Hasidism, Rachel Elior, writes in one of her books that Chabad is premised on the denial of experience. Because after all, we all live in the world and we experience things, and they have the solidity and reality and firmness. And mysticism, from her point of view, means turning your back on that and being able to clear the slate, as it were, so that the basic experience of the world doesn't impinge upon your mystical consciousness. And with respect, she's a great scholar, but I always thought that that was a wrong starting point, because rather than clearing or denying everyday experience, it seems to me that Chabad notions, for example, of bittul, right, self-abnegation, which are paradoxically very important to the notion of interconnectivity between human beings, in the way that I'll talk about in a moment, that these grow not so much out of the denial of lived experience, but rather focusing on certain types or certain kinds of lived experience and building those out, right? Building them in a way that makes them perhaps more front and center than they would be in normal everyday experience. Okay, now one of the first times I realized this is when I was doing some ethnographic field work on a college campus. And this was at the very beginning of my work. And I turned to the Chabad rabbi there as he was gathering the students around for the third meal on the Sabbath, Sudash Shlishit. And I said to him, you know, I've been thinking a lot about this idea of bittul. Do you think that's a good starting place for my research? And his eyes lit up. He said, of course, that's so important. And anybody who studies Chabad texts knows that this notion of self-abnegation, there are many different possible translations. I think Elliot Wolfson quite correctly translates this term in about a dozen ways throughout his book, as it appears in different contexts, but it's often translated as self-abnegation. He got very excited. You can't open a book in the Chabad library without coming across this term with more or less detail and emphasis. So I asked him to start giving me some examples of what bittul looks like. And I was expecting him to talk to me about his deep experience of prayer, right, tefillah ba'avoda, or other kinds of things that we typically look at and label and as religion scholars and say, oh, there goes mystical experience. But instead, he started talking about completely different things. He started talking about helping an old lady across the street when she needs help across the street. He talked about standing back in line and letting a fellow student get ahead of you and get food first. He began talking about all of these sort of very almost minor everyday experiences, each of which had about them an element of this putting the self back, not putting the self forward as the central act in the social drama. And he connected all of these in his own mind seamlessly with the exalted states of bittul described by Chabad mystics throughout the generations. He saw these not as separate things, but as gradations along a continuum. And the more that I've studied, the more that I've sort of come to agree, not only that that's the experience of many Hasidim, but that that's probably a valuable way to look at the topic. Now, how does self-abnegation relate to sociality and interconnectedness? Well, the examples that I just gave, putting somebody else first on some level, holding oneself back from full recognition at every moment, are of course key to social interactivity. No human society can exist without individuals at some points being willing to abnegate themselves. And some sociologists, phenomenological sociologists and philosophers have argued that this stance may be key to the acquisition of language, that language requires the ability to put oneself at certain key moments in the position of another person and to look at the world to look at oneself, as it were, from outside, to be able to engage with somebody else's view of the situation. And it seems to me that that sort of very basic human skill, which all of us have by virtue of being humans and having access to language and society, really is just a more generalized or less specialized example of the kind of consciousness that in Chabad texts is talked about as bittul or self-abnegation. Now, just very quickly, I'll relate to one particular text in which this connection is made very, very clearly, which is the famous essay of the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, the fifth Chabad rabbi, Kuntras Hechaltzu, which is an extended meditation on the relationship between interpersonal ethics and self-abnegation, which are two things that you might think are not connected to one another, right? Mystical experience over here and interpersonal ethics over here, and why should they be connected with one another? It's interesting to note, by the way, that the language of bittul originates not with mysticism, but the language originates in the world of Jewish law. So we talk about the annulment of leavened products before Passover by an act of will, or the annulment of an idolatrous object through an act of will of its owner. There are many, many contexts in sort of everyday life where this term is used, in which it seems to me not the denial of existence, but the putting of things in a certain perspective so that they're no longer so important. I would almost call it contingency. And this is very clear, I think, in the first chapter of Maimonides' Code of Law, where he's one of the first people to use this term philosophically or metaphysically to mean cessation of existence. And I think that later Kabbalah and Chabad certainly were sensitive to that use. Now, the Rebbe Rashab in Kuntras Hechaltzu identifies interpersonal conflict as the result of insufficient personal self-abnegation. A person thinks that they are all that, right? They're all that yesh, that existence, and therefore they don't really provide room for the other person to exist. Of course, the other person pushes back, and there you have interpersonal conflict. And the way to avoid interpersonal conflict is therefore to tamp down some of that egoism. It sounds on the face of it very similar to the ethics of Emmanuel Levinas, who was constantly talking about the need to efface oneself, to put the other first, and uses the same language of tzimtzum, of self-contraction. But I want to point out one very important difference between the way this term is used in Chabad and the way this term is used, for instance, by Levinas and other people in his ilk. Was that Levinas was very much a Lithuanian non-Hasidic Jew. And in his essays, he praises, in particular, Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin, the author of Nefesh HaChaim, who, at least according to some sources, had a very different view of what self-abnegation meant. And here it is in a nutshell. The Hasidic view was always that self-nullification is, on some level, illusory, just the way self is illusory. In other words, God is all that exists. I perceive myself as existing, but at certain moments, I'm able to sort of turn the spotlight away from myself and see only God, right? But nothing has changed metaphysically, right? I'm still here as much as I was before. I'm still here. My contingency is highlighted. Whereas according to certain strains of Lithuanian Kabbalah, according to many people going back to the Gaon of Vilna, there's a lot of debate about this, the tzimtzum was real in the fact that it really created an empty space, not just cosmologically, but in the thinking of somebody like Levinas, psychologically, ethically. The question is whether there's really a space between people that you're opening up, or whether you're just creating an illusion of space. It's a kind of language game, which may in fact be very important to ethics, but not entail the kind of separation, kind of deep separation that I think that Levinas does push for. Whereas for Levinas, the basis of ethics is to recognize the alterity of the other, the right of the other person to be other and different. And I think that in Kuntres Hechaltzu, the point is to tamp down egoism so that everybody can be shown to merge in their general participation in the Jewish or the Hasidic ethos. So I just want to say, first of all, I'll end by just saying, I guess, a couple of major points. One is that my sense is that the relationship between connectivity and mystical experience needs to be sought, first of all, in the world of everyday life, before we start talking about very specialized sort of mystical experiences that not all Hasidim, by the way, have or can tell you about, but everybody has these everyday experiences. Second of all, that I think we need to be alert to the cultural and religious differences that exist between different strains of Jewish thought and even different strains of mystical thought, and by the way, different strains of Hasidic thought. So Shaul Magid, who's one of the experts on the Yizbitzer Radzin dynasty, knows that their approach to these topics is very different than the Chabad approach. And there's something problematic, I think, about collapsing everything into everything else. I think the process of understanding requires, first of all, making these distinctions, sort of like the Rebbe Rashab says. You have to make these distinctions, withdraw the self, but in order to allow a later, greater understanding to emerge. And the final thing I'll say is that I once asked Chabadnik, in the absence of the Rebbe, now that the Rebbe had died, how will the Hasidim manage the forces of entropy that threaten to pull them apart in a million different directions? And he answered without even hesitating a bit. He said, we all fabrang together, which is a Hasidic term meaning a certain kind of social mystical gathering that Wexler talks about in the book. And from his point of view, that was the social glue that would hold the Chabad community together no matter what. I'm not sure whether that was an overly optimistic statement. And I'm not sure exactly how to take Wexler's very broad understanding of the re-enchantment of the universe and apply it practically in a way that recognizes not only its strengths, but also its potential limits. With that, I'll stop.
Thank you, Don. I'll have some remarks when we have some responses. But for now, let's go to Shaul Magid. Sure. You're muted, Shaul.
Sorry, thank you. I wanted to thank Philip and Eli both for the project and for the book. Also, Rabbi Menachem Schmidt, who I'm going to mention in a moment, for organizing the Institute or being a part of organizing the Institute, and also for Jonah for all of the technical work. He's been great about that. So I'm going to get to Neo-Hasidism toward the end of my remarks, but there's a certain kind of circuitous path that I want to take in order to get there. I want to begin with three short anecdotes that's going to really frame what I have to say. The first anecdote is something that some of you remember because some of you were there. There was a meeting some years ago in Boston at a hotel with Rabbi Menachem Schmidt and Eli and Philip, and Don was there. I think Elliot Wolfson was there. Yoni Garb was there. A lot of people in this conference were at that meeting. And this was a discussion about the project, about the Institute. And one of the questions that we asked Rabbi Schmidt was, what do you really want from us as academics? And his response was that part of the project is that he wanted both Chabad and the Lubavitcher Rebbe to be taken seriously as an academic subject and by academics. And my response to him was that, we're perfectly willing to do that, but academics function as critics. And if you want us to look at Lubavitcher Rebbe in an academic context, then we're going to do it critically, and that he's going to be no different than any other thinker that we might examine, from Moses Mendelssohn to Solomon Scheck to Mordechai Kaplan. I mean, he just becomes a figure within a canon of Jewish thinkers. And Rabbi Schmidt said, I understand. And so I want to really begin my remarks with taking his prompt, so to speak, which then brings me to the second anecdote in a conference that we had some years ago that ended up coming out with a book. Eli was there, Philip was there, Don was there, a lot of others. I stated publicly that I wasn't going to be referring to Lubavitcher Rebbe as the Rebbe. And the reason that I wasn't going to refer to him as the Rebbe was very simple, because he's not my Rebbe. And some of the people organizing the conference were very upset with me afterwards. They came up to me and they said they felt I was being disrespectful. And I meant no disrespect. But in the evening, some of the young shluchim came up to me and said, you know, we actually agree. You gave a Hasidic response. If he's not your Rebbe, then don't call him the Rebbe. That's, in a certain sense, in other words, they understood that the notion of the Rebbe carries weight. And if you take that seriously, it will be. So I'm going to refer to him as Schneerson. The third anecdote. There's a professor of infectious diseases in Houston at Baylor Medical School named Daniel Musher. And I used to go, when I taught at Rice, I used to go over to his house for Shabbos very often. So he told me this story. Turns out that Daniel Musher is the grandson of Mordechai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism. His mother was Hadassah, who was Mordechai Kaplan, I think, the youngest daughter. Anyway, he gets a call from the chair of his department. And the chair of the department says, I just got a call from Crown Heights, Brooklyn. And it was the secretary of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And the secretary of the Lubavitcher Rebbe said, you know, the Rebbe has certain difficulties, certain problems. And I'm wondering if you could recommend somebody. So the chair of the department says, oh, let me think about it. So the secretary says, let me put the Rebbe on the phone. So the Rebbe gets on the phone. And the chair of the department says, actually, the person that you're looking for is a doctor that I have in my department named Daniel Musher. And it happens to be an interesting coincidence that he is the grandson of a famous rabbi. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe says, who is the rabbi? And the chair says, his name was Mordechai Kaplan. And there's silence on the phone. And the Rebbe says, do you have somebody else? Now, the reason that I bring this in is because I think there's personally an interesting connection between Mordechai Kaplan and Menachem Mendel Schneerson. I think that Mordechai Kaplan was probably the most incisive and one of the most important American Jewish thinkers of the early part of the 20th century. And I think Menachem Mendel Schneerson is one of the most incisive and important American Jewish thinkers in the latter part of the 20th century. The reason why Kaplan was so important in the first part was because he understood, like few others, the challenges and opportunities of Judaism in democracy. He understood what the issues were, he understood what the sacrifices might be, and he understood what the potential might be for Jews to flourish in a true democracy. Schneerson, living in the second part of the 20th century, understood, like few other Jewish thinkers, orthodox or non-orthodox, the challenges and opportunities of multiculturalism. And I think long before multiculturalism became fashionable in the 1980s, back in the 1960s, I think that Schneerson understood what was coming. He understood a post-war America, and he was able to formulate a program that would meet the challenges of multiculturalism and also be able to use the opportunities that multiculturalism offers. Now, my remarks really are not about Schneerson per se, but about Schneerson as he is portrayed in Social Vision. And I wrote an essay that was a review, somewhat critical of the book in Tablet Magazine in 2019, and I want to rehearse some of these ideas and develop them. So basically, as I understand Social Vision, it's trying to make an argument that Schneerson is a kind of, offering a kind of universalist, humanist project of global social transformation from deep within the particularism of Judaism. Now, it's interesting, Larry Schiffman last week noted that this universalism, particularism paradigm is something that filters through Judaism from the beginning, at least from the rabbis onward. and later, as it emerges in late 20th century American religion and in the Aquarian age, that begins to envision a kind of global transformation through this newfangled universalist spirituality. And this relates somewhat to what Peter was talking about. My argument is that while I think that Schneerson was an invaluable Jewish leader and interpreter of both Hasidic tradition and the times he lived in, he is not the social reformer that he is portrayed to be in Social Vision. And I want to unpack this a little bit. I think there is in Schneerson, as I understand him, a tension. On the one hand, he truly believed that America was the last station of the diaspora before redemption, and that the place that redemption will come from will not be Israel and America. And I can talk about why I think he's an anti-Zionist in a moment, or if we have time during the questions. But in any event, he had the inclination to move beyond the parameters of the world that he came from. And there I think the vision is really there. But I think that he did not succeed in doing so because as deeply as he was committed to the idea that this is the end of the exile, he was as deeply committed to normative, halachic, orthodox life and ideology. And I think that his commitment to the normative qualities of Jewish Orthodox life prevented him from actually moving to the place where he might have been inclined to move. And I want to give a few examples. So, first example, it's very difficult for me to think that a person can portray themselves as a global visionary of humanistic religion and prohibit going into a church because it's a makam avodah zarah, because it's idolatry. Now, that would be the idea of the prohibition to go into a church because it's a place of idolatry is a normative part of the halakhic tradition. Yeah, there are exceptions in certain cases, but generally that's a normative position. For a person to maintain that separation, not that you would not go into another place of worship. I mean, could one imagine the Dalai Lama saying, I don't go into that place of worship because it's forbidden to me, because it's prohibited to me? I just think it wouldn't exist. So I'm not faulting him for doing that, but I'm saying that the very idea that he remains bound to the binaries, Ariel talked about the overcoming binaries, it doesn't really become transcendent. And this is what Eliot meant last week. The transcendent itself is embedded in the non-transcendence of these binaries. So that's one thing. Secondly, and they're related on the Noahide laws. The Noahide campaign was a tremendous campaign, no doubt, the most successful Noahide campaign in Jewish history. But it certainly wasn't the only one. We can point to people like Elia ben Amozeg in the late 19th century, whose Israel and Humanity was saturated with Noahide laws and Noahidism, what he calls Noahism. But the interesting thing about the Noahide laws is that if we go back, and I'm sure many people on the call know, if you go back to Maimonides and the Laws of Kings, the very notion of being one of the righteous Gentiles or being a Ger Toshav or being a Noahide is not only doing the Noahide laws, but acknowledging that they come from Sinai as an expression of divine election of the Jews. Therefore, first of all, if Christians are idolaters, they Bechlal can't be Noahides. And even if you hold that Christianity is not idolatry, Christianity itself is built on a principle of supersessionism that would deny the very principle that would make Noahidism possible. So although there's this idea of taking this Noahide notion of creating social society, from within the halachic tradition that Schneerson is committed to, none of those people can really be Noahides because they don't meet the criteria, either because they're supersessionists or because they're idolaters. Now, there is some interesting work been done on variants of that Maimonides in Hilchot Malachim, where maybe there's a change in the manuscript of the words, but I don't think that the main point, I think the main point stands. Next, I want to take issue with the idea of Schneerson and religious pluralism. I don't read Schneerson as a religious pluralist. I read him as a Sinaitic monist. That is, he believes, like the normative tradition, that truth emerges in this world from Sinai, given to the Jewish people. Sparks may have been thrown out into the world. The Kabbalah, the Lurianic tradition surely tells us that. But generally speaking, the redemptive vision is not a social vision of transformation through pluralism. It's a social vision of transformation where the world comes to recognize the election of Israel, where the world comes to recognize the exclusivity of Israel's relationship to God vis-a-vis other nations. In other words, it doesn't really fit into any model of global religious transformation that I'm aware of. Now, maybe I'll leave the Zionism part aside and come back to it because I wanted to. Well, I have a minute. I think I've had a lot of arguments with Chabadnik about this. I think that the Lubavitcher Rebbe was as anti-Zionist as the Satmar Rebbe was. It was just a different attack on Zionism. And as the Satmar Rebbe, Yoel Teitelbaum, was against the establishment of a secular Jewish state before Messiah. In other words, it was an attack on political Zionism. Schneerson was more sympathetic to the existence of a secular state, although I don't think he recognizes it as having any validity. And here I think Yitzhak Ginsburg is close to Schneerson on that question, different on other questions, obviously. I think that for Schneerson, the state of Israel was legitimate because it gave an opportunity for Jews to live in Israel and because it served as a refuge for Jews. It helped, it created a kind of a life raft for Jews. What he was vehemently opposed to was any kind of cultural Zionism, any notion that from Achad Ha'am of the secularization of Judaism as a religion to create a national culture. In fact, I think one could make the argument, and I can't do so here because I don't have the time, that the entire project of contemporary Lubavitch is a contestation of cultural Zionism. It's offering an alternative vision of Jewishness in the late 20th century or in the 20th century, the way that cultural Zionism offered an alternative vision of Judaism as being the cultural manifestation of a kind of secularized people. Now, I want to get to what I'm supposed to talk about, which is Neo-Hasidism, because what I find interesting, and here I think, and by the way, I think that Eli and Philip's book on social vision, they got it exactly right, that the project of Lubavitch is America. In the Lubavitcher Rebbe's mind, America was the place, was the opportunity to finally come to the end of exile. The other thing that they got right is, interestingly enough, at the end of the book, they start talking about Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who was, of course, first a chassid of the Rayatz, of the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, then of the Ramash, of Schneerson, the seventh Lubavitcher Rebbe. What I think is so interesting, and I think this was Philip and Eli's intuition, that the project of social transformation that they claim is embodied in Schneerson is actually embodied in Schachter Shalomi. In other words, he took the Chabad vision and moved it beyond the normative framework of orthodoxy and halacha, which in large part is structured to prevent that vision, to create separation, to maintain difference, to sustain the binary. And so the tension that exists in Schneerson of wanting to go beyond, but not being able to, I think Schachter Shalomi actually makes that move. And then he basically reconstructs halacha in light of his belief in the Aquarian age, his belief in the end of exile, however he articulates it. So strangely enough, I mean, my intuitions through reading the book was, wait, they're actually describing Schachter Shalomi. And then at the end of the book, they describe Schachter Shalomi. I mean, it's fascinating because I think that I felt like Baruch Shekavanti when I got there, that in a certain way, I think that Eli and Philip intuitively realized that in order for that vision to become more manifest, it had to actually break out of a particular paradigm that was itself constructed to do the opposite of what they claim Schneerson was trying to do. And I say this not only in terms of halacha, because Larry Schiffman last week mentioned, right, you have to talk about halacha. So when, if Ariel earlier talked about, the transcendence of the binary, was, yeah, but Chabadnikim are not going into a church. In other words, they're maintaining the strictures of the binary, even though they're trying to move it. So in a sense, I think that, and this swings to what Don is saying, that yes, the social vision has to take metaphysics and politicize it or socialize it in a way. But I think when that happens, Schneerson gets stuck because he can't really move beyond that. So, you know, I want to be clear here. I mean, no disrespect to it whatsoever. I think that in a way, Schneerson is one of the most important Jews of the 20th century. I'm somehow a little bit curious why Chabadnikim aren't satisfied with that. And why take it one step further? Why not just say he was one of the great Jewish leaders of Jewish modernity, which I think that he was, and to try to move him into this realm of being a kind of global social visionary. I mean, I think it's interesting, but I don't really think it works, except in the case of Shakta Shalomi, who really becomes, on social vision's criteria, the real chassid of Schneerson. So I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaul. Your critical voice is always essential to these conversations. As you said, the critical voice is what makes scholarship scholarship. So thank you. And let's first hear from the other panelists, if everyone can respond to each other. I don't know if Peter wants to go first. We'll go, if we can go in the same order. And then.
So Eli and Shaul and Don, that's splendid. I mean, you guys are so imbued in the history and the culture in a way that I'm not, that I really enjoyed that. And I'm going to ask a question that I think tries to bridge between the two of you. I have to say, when I was, you know, reading about the three loves, and there was the love of God, the love of the Torah, and the love of the Jewish people, every time it became Jewish, I thought, wait a minute, where's the universalist in this? And that goes back to the session yesterday about the particular and the universalist. So you're imbued in the particularity of a particular cultural and faith tradition, which I'm not. I kind of spoke from the point of view, I saw resonances in that were universal. But I could see, I like critical academics, and I really enjoyed that, Sean. But this notion of just was he, what was the balance between his kind of universalist America is the place we're going to grow something, and it's not going to be Jewish anymore, it's going to be for everybody, and you know, the Orthodox traditions that he preserved. So the link to Don, in my mind, and maybe it doesn't exist, is and I love the idea that you start with mysticism in the immanent. I mean, this whole notion that, you know, before Enlightenment, take out the garbage, after Enlightenment, take out the garbage, or the whole notion that Enlightenment is not some, you know, ethereal state, it's somehow built into real life. So in terms of the seeking of the universalist, is there truth, and you said, I think you said you're a student of different religions, that if you get into the depths of that kind of conception of what the mystical is, do you actually create, as I intimated in my talk, universalistic bridges between the mystics of different traditions? I mean, people often say this, if the mystics wouldn't fight with each other because they somehow agree on things that I do agree are embedded in real life. So I don't know, that was a bit too long-winded for a question, but I was kind of asking a question to the two of you, so I get a little extra time, if Eli permits it.
Sure.
Do either one of you want to respond to what I said? I mean,
I would happy to respond. Don, you want to start?
You go first, Joe.
Okay, so it's a very good question. And I think to start with the end of your question, I think, yes, there is that tradition of mystics solving the problem of the political, and someone like Menachem Fruman, for example, in Israel, was someone who was a settler rabbi who met with Muslim sheikhs and Sufi sheikhs because he felt that that was really the way to solve the political problem there. I guess I would ask the question, and I think that you bring up the point, right, that the tension of the universal in particular exists in Schneerson more than in many others, because I think he saw we were kind of reaching the end. I guess the question that I have is, I don't, and this is why I say that Schneerson was a Sinaitic monist. I don't think that he thought that Jews had anything to learn from other religions, because Torah encompassed everything. So that in a sense, the very particularism that embeds that monism makes it such that we can talk to other religions, but we really don't have anything to learn from them. This is where I think Shakta Shalomi breaks it apart, to say, actually, no, there's a corruption. Even if you want to say that Sinai gives us the full truth, over time, tradition corrupts that, and there are elements of truth that get spun out to other traditions, and engaging with other traditions is a way of recollecting a certain sense of that monistic whole. But I really don't think that Schneerson wanted to go there. I don't think he was willing to acknowledge that. He wasn't even willing to acknowledge that Christianity wasn't idolatry. So you can have the distinction, okay, it's idolatry for the Jew, but not idolatry for the non-Jew. You could make all those distinctions. But again, I think that normativity prevented him from moving in that direction. And I wanted to answer Don's question, but I'll do in the chat, but I'll do that after Don. You respond first.
Sorry, took me a moment to unmute. So that's great. I actually have never been a great believer in the idea that all mystical paths lead to the same place. Everybody will get along if only they can tap into that sort of thing. I think everything is dependent upon the ideological structure in which it's couched, because nobody lives in a, quote, mystical experience. They live in a world of culture and language and institutions and norms that can be vivified by certain kinds of experiences, but not necessarily. To use Shaul's example, Yitzhak Ginsburg, I think, is one of the most interesting contemporary mystics, and to my mind, completely xenophobic, and in a very exclusivist and negative way. And it may be, and I'm just thinking about this now for the first time as I'm hearing Shaul talk, that he represents one extreme of the tension that the Lubavitcher Rebbe held within himself, and Shakta Shlomi represents the other side of the tension, which is universalistic. Where I think I would disagree with Shaul a little bit is that I think that tension, I think he was very aware of that tension. I think that the tension itself is what's normative, and probably goes back. I mean, certainly you find it in Maimonides, but you find it in Rashi. I mean, so this is deeply embedded, sort of. Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Today he's our God, but in the future he'll be everybody's God. I think Rabbi Schneerson was very sensitive to that tension, and that was where a lot of the power of the vision came from. Like once you pull that tension out, it sort of collapses as not being all that interesting, at least for traditionalists. But I would add one thing that I think is I'm still trying to develop as an idea, and this comes from, I started thinking about this at our last conference when I heard Elliot Wolfson speak. I think that the assumption that's made is that in modern Jewish intellectual history, or modern intellectual history, modern social history, the Jew stands in for the particular over against the universal world of the Gentile. And Jews have seen themselves that way and have responded to that in a variety of different ways, by trying to join the universal, by trying to carve out a space for themselves as the particular. Zionism is one response to that, and Orthodoxy and ultra-Orthodoxy is a response to that. They're all different responses. I think what makes Rabbi Schneerson unique in my view is I think he rejected that entire duality. I think he believed that just like in the future, all of the world becomes Eretz Yisrael, becomes imbued with the sanctity of the land of Israel. So there's a sense in which the universal becomes the Jewish, and it's no longer the particular. And under that framework, the tension also disappears, but in a different way than Rabbi Shakta Shalomi imagines. In other words, it disappears because the vision takes over everything. And that's, I think, why, I mean, I won't speak for Chabad in the presence of Eli Rubin, or not in the presence of Eli Rubin, but it seems to me that that's why they can't be satisfied with simply acknowledging that he was a great leader of modern Judaism, because until that vision becomes universal, there's a sense in which he didn't succeed. The job is not yet complete. So I think the continuing existence of the movement is almost premised upon I mean, unless it just wants to fall back into itself and become, again, a sort of insular, movement. But I think the existence of Chabad today is premised on finding more expansive ways to express itself. At least that's how I would see it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I just want to make two very short comments. First of all, the comparison of Ginsburg and Shabtai Shalomi is a great one, and it would be good to tease that out more. I do think that Ginsburg and Shabtai Shalomi are two iterations of Schneerson, that both of them lived within the person of, the person of Menachem Mendel Schneerson, and that both of them are expressing a particular part of that vision that doesn't have the same kind of tension. I agree with you, but that in a sense spins off in different directions. And that speaks to, I think, in many ways, the greatness of Schneerson, that he held that together. I guess my only caveat would be that I think that he believed, and I don't share this belief with him, he believed that the social transformative vision can become manifest without sacrificing normative halakha. And I think that's not true. And I think Shabtai Shalomi knew that that was not true. And I think that Mordechai Kaplan knew that was not true. I think that those people realized that something had to give, something had to change, precisely because I don't think it's controversial to say that as and you're an anthropologist, a social scientist, I think that one could argue that the entire edifice of the halachic tradition is constructed to do just the opposite. Separate, to keep people, sure. to keep the Jews separate. So I think that, again, I think he came up against kind of a brick wall of maybe his own context, his own upbringing, his own thinking. But this is where I think it kind of goes off the rails for me a little bit anyway.
So could I bring, I don't know how you want to handle it, you've got questions in the chat, but one thing I'm appreciating is Eli's important role in this that I didn't understand because all my connections were with Philip. So thank you, Eli, again. But you're young, and the rest of us have gray hair. And the thing that I thought was really amazing about this movement is how much it's energized young people on college campuses. So if you didn't, I know you can't speak for younger folks, but what do you think? Because I'm interested in the generational, right? So what is it about the power of this movement that appeals to young people? That seems to me to be essential to appreciate and spread that, because that's what we have to do in this world, get the young people.
Is that for me?
That was for you, because you got this night. Yes. Well,
okay. Well, I don't know if I can answer the question on one foot, but I think one thing that I was thinking about, really hearing all of you speak, is that we've spoken a lot about this tension between the normative and the visionary inclination to expand, to use Elliot Wolfson's term, the hypernomian idea, that the normative itself can be somehow expanded without losing the normative, without eradicating the bounds of the normative, but within the bounds, within that tension, with the tension that is enforced by remaining within the bounds, to somehow overcome and go beyond. Elliot has a phrase which is used in various contexts. In order to go beyond the path, you have to tread the path. So I think there's something here about a trajectory. The Rebbe, or let's call him Schneerson.
He's your Rebbe. You have to call him.
You're right. He is my Rebbe. But I wear different hats at different moments, and sometimes I think this is really going off topic. But for me, an important part of being a chassid of the Rebbe is to also be a scholar and to approach it from a critical perspective. So I think the Schneerson perspective is also equally important. That's why I'm here, to see him as Schneerson and not just as the Rebbe, and in doing so, be able to see more clearly what he wanted. So, but the point I wanted to make is that there's a trajectory here. There is a vision means that you're at a certain place and you're looking towards something else. something going, you're heading somewhere. And the question is, does that trajectory end with the end of the Rebbe's life on this earth, or is it something that needs to continue? And I think this speaks both to what Peter was asking about, what young people see in this, and also to some of what Shaul is saying about coming up against a brick wall. Well, do we come up against a brick wall, or does the tension continue to ensure that we need to push forward? We need to find new ways to climb over the wall, to go over the wall, maybe still without breaking the wall down. So I think that's that idea of a trajectory, that there's something continuing here, there's something that's moving along, that's developing, that has not come to its conclusion, and that can continue to develop. And I think this is really at the heart of Philip's project, is in a way to appropriate the Rebbe, but I believe legitimately to appropriate the Rebbe and use him for apply ideas that he expressed in one context and lift them from that context and see how they can work in a more universal form. I don't know.
No,
I think.
Go ahead, Mark. Go, Don. Go ahead.
No, I just look, Shaul. This is a conversation you and I keep on coming back to over decades, in response to different Hasidic and Messianic figures. I think that this is not something that can be adjudicated exactly, but there are going to be people who believe in living within the tension and think that there's probably no way to escape it. And maybe that's what encourages them to go down one path. And there are people who feel like the tension has reached its end point, and they take another direction. But these are existential questions; they're not just intellectual ones. And I think that what unites somebody like the Lubavitcher Rebbe and Rav Kook and the Ishbitzer Rebbe, for example, is a willingness to live in a very acute version of that tension without giving up on any side of the equation. And obviously not everybody is interested in doing that or can do that. So I think what you're describing is a very real sociological, spiritual phenomenon, but I think it's difficult to judge sort of what the Lubavitcher Rebbe himself would have thought about it. I mean, I think all we know is sort of what he did, and continued to put on tefillin every day. So anyway, that's all.
I think that's true. So I agree with you, but I think that if we want to look past the person into the reception, we can see that, while that's true of Rev Kook, he's a great example. I think what's become of Rev Kook in its contemporary iteration is a very, very particular view which doesn't actually hold that tension. And I think that potentially what comes out of Chabad post-Schneerson is, again, I think that it's continuing a project, but time is moving on and things are changing. And this goes back to something that Nathaniel Berman asked last week, that today people aren't necessarily asking, oh, you be a Jew and you be an Italian, you be an Irish, but it's already about post-ethnic. We're already living in a different paradigm. And I think that people who want to maintain the tension that Schneerson introduced in his context have to also see that when that context changes, they have to reconfigure the paradigm in light of how they see that vision becoming manifest. And I think that Shabtai Shalomi did that. I mean, he looked beyond multiculturalism. He saw the post-ethnic coming. He saw the Aquarian age coming. And I think that was part of his paradigm shift, that the paradigm has changed. And if the paradigm changes, then its social manifestation has to change too. So it can't be, we go out and try to, and try to get Jews to light, Hanukkah candles, or we go out and try to get Gentiles to be Noahides, but we daven with each other, put on Rashi and Rebbeinu Tam tefillin, chas v'shalom, go into a Reform synagogue, not even to speak of a church. I just don't think that it actually is sustainable, as in terms of projecting the vision onward. It's sustainable in terms of a community. The community can continue to exist, but the question is, what about the project?
Yeah, that's why I think the study of the heretics of Chabad is very important,
Of
and
course.
has not been done enough. And right now we're in the midst of an arc of a narrative in which Chabad is ascendant. Other forms of American Judaism seem to be in disarray, and Chabad is, the conservative synagogue where I grew up has become a Chabad house, and that's not an unfamiliar story. Part of the question will be how long Chabad is able to maintain that, and when it really begins to come up against, as it does on American campuses, and somehow finesses, but as it really comes up against radically different value systems that young people are bringing to, with regard to gender, for example, whether Chabad will succeed in continuing to hold their attention in that tension, I don't know. I think that remains to be seen. And it will probably lead some to become heretics because they're going to want to keep pursuing.
Right.
So can I just expand on this by asking the following? By the way, I will say that I sometimes called myself an amateur Buddhist, figuring the Dalai Lama is about the only one religious leader who would chuckle at that. I don't know what some of your Orthodox rabbis would say if I said I was an amateur Jew. On the other hand, let's not go there. My question is, we're in a different era. Whether this movement persists or not will have a lot to do with what's happening in the world. What's happening in the world is devastating effects of human behavior on nature. What does this tradition say about what we can learn from nature, whether it's God or nature itself? Because nature holds the particular and the general in a very interesting way. We are in the sixth extinction. We are losing diversity at the same time as appreciating the complexities of the whole ecosystems. So to me, nature holds the conversation between the particular and the general in a very rich way, which is our life is dependent on. So biomimicry is kind of the word used to, what can we learn from nature? So what can this movement learn from nature that might relate to the general and the particular?
I think the global question, is a good one. I think it's interesting that Shakta Shalomi said that the most powerful religious experience that he had was when he saw the photograph of the moon. The photograph of the Earth that was taken from the moon. I mean, the idea that you have this, magnificent blue ball floating in space, that everything in it and everything on it is alive. It's not that the Earth is inorganic matter that holds organic matter, but that the Earth itself is organic. I mean, the Gaia hypothesis. That this changed his whole view on humanity as well as on nature. And so he rewrote the laws of kashrut to include environmentalism, not as a preference, but as a criteria of kashrut, right? To say that if something was grown in a way that's destructive to the earth, it no longer has the status of being kosher, even if it fills all the kosher laws. So I think that he definitely had that. I think that Schneerson had a sense of that too, but again, he wasn't able to really move into that Gaia mentality for a variety of reasons.
Okay, I'm going to introduce some questions from the chat. We only have a few minutes left. So the first from Eli Schneiderman for Shaul, but I think this is something that everyone can respond to. How can we be sure that the paradigm has changed, as Shaul suggests, or whether universalists have merely been absorbed into the hegemonic? So, yeah, it's a good question, and focusing especially on what is the distinction really between being a universalist and just homogenizing everything.
Right. I mean, it's a great question, and the answer is that we can't. I mean, there's not going to be any smoking gun. There's not going to be any evidence. There's not going to be any revelation that's going to say the paradigm has changed. I mean, that is a hermeneutical move. You look at the world and you make an assessment as to where we are in the larger kind of trajectory of human civilization. In terms of homogenizing, I mean, that's always the danger of universalism. It's always the occupational hazard of universalism, right? So I don't think that certainly Zalman as a universalist was not a homogenist. He wasn't basically saying we should erase differences. He's saying that we should erase hierarchies. And that's the difference. The difference is not the erasure of difference, it's the erasure of hierarchy. And that becomes the most challenging thing for Jews who come into existence as being divinely elected. I mean, Kaplan knew one of the things that had to go if Jews were going to flourish in a democracy was the notion of divine election. You can't live in a world thinking you're elected over all of the peoples and be able to function in an integral way in democracy. And so he rejects the notion of divine election. So I think that the question is definitely a good one. And look, anytime you make a move, there could be occupational hazards. There can be occupational hazards with a kind of more of a robust particularism, more of a universalism. So it's always about navigating those hazards and trying to avoid them in order to achieve the best outcome that you can.
Don, do you want to say that or say something? Or Peter?
No, not right now.
Okay, Peter, go ahead.
I'll say something quickly that I think the world's most dangerous religion at the moment is scientism, because basically that's in the secular world, the universalist notion that is hegemonic. And I think I'm a scientist, so this notion that somehow science has allied itself with capitalism, we've got neoliberalism. So I mean, if you're talking about the dangers of a faith system that is dominant in the world, that claims to universalism, but also claims not to be a religion. So I mean, that may not be an answer to the question, but it's my reflection on this notion of hegemony and universalism.
Okay, so one more question that's been asked in the chat is, this is again directed at Shaul, but again, I think everyone can respond. Moving away from the Rebbe specifically and from Zionism, I'm not sure what Zionism is doing that, but what is your view of the need and role of mysticism in the future of society as a whole?
Again,
so this is a question for Shaul. And as Shaul,
Don, I'm sure has plenty to say about this too. I mean, it's a great question. I don't think that this younger generation, Gen Zers, are mystically oriented by nature. Certainly not the way boomers were like me. We came into the world through the Aquarian age, through psychedelic drugs. It was a whole different mindset and kind of coming off immediate post-war conformist materialism. I think Gen Zers have other issues, and one of their really major issues is basically climate change and the future of the planet. Now, how that issue, which I think is a driving issue for many Gen Zers, how that issue was going to be integrated into the existent axial religions or even non-axial religions, I think the future and the success of those religions are really going to depend upon how the religion itself can be seen as providing solutions to the question of the future of the planet. And I think that's going to become the new mysticism for me. That's the way I see it. Don?
I don't know exactly how to answer the question. I tend to not be so quick to imagine that human beings have changed in any deep, real way. I think that socio-cultural moments come and go, but the real problems that people concern remain the real problems that people concern. And whether we're Gen Zers or whatever boomers, I think that you can make too much of those distinctions, although obviously there's something to them. But I think that one way of looking at this question is to look at the divide and the debates within Chabad today. So, do you need mysticism? There are lots of Chabadnikim who think that no, the challenge of this generation is not to pray more deeply or to encounter God. It's to put more tefillin on people. And I've heard this exact debate play out among emissaries, among shluchim. And I've heard debates between those who think of themselves as representing old school Chabad and their critique of what they consider to be corporate Chabad, right? To talk about the hegemony. So this is not just a question that the rest of us have to figure out, but this is a question that Chabad has to figure out. And I think seeing those tensions within the movement is the best evidence there is that those tensions exist outside the movement also in the larger world. From what I have seen, the dominant trend today seems, even within Chabad, not to be mysticism, but to be greater and greater activism with this kind of messianic universalist bent. How long that can go on, what happens when it comes against the fact that every Rebbetzin uses plastic because she has to cook for 250 people on the Shabbos, right? And there is no gay marriage right? And how long Chabad will be able to go on expanding as it comes up against those boundaries, I don't know. But this is a problem that faces all traditional religions, and Chabad no differently than any.
Okay, well, we're coming up to the end of our time, so I'm going to just thank everyone. I do see that there are more questions in the chat, but hopefully we'll be able to hear from others in the sessions to come. And so I want to thank Don Seeman, Peter Whitehouse, and Shaul Magid for all of your contributions, and for everyone who's listening, and for everyone who wrote in their comments. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Eli. Yeah, this was a fascinating topic. I love listening to these. I love when I'm not moderating and I can just listen. For everyone, we get a little bit of a break, 15 minutes, and then at 3, we're going to come back together for spirituality and social justice. That'll be with Jeffrey Cripple, Jody E. Myers, Dale Danifer, Shlomo Fisher, and Bruce Gitlin. So please do what you got to do, get a snack, go to the bathroom, and come back and rejoin us. This will be the same link. You don't have to leave. We'll just switch everyone out. And again, if there's more questions that people have, please join us after the conference ends at 5:15-ish in the breakout room, which you can get the link through here, and we can continue these conversations. And yeah, anyway, thank you so much, and we look forward to the next learning.
Thank you, Jonah. Nice meeting you, Peter. Great hearing you. And Eli, as always.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.